between the commercial impulse and the regulatory impulse. And so part of our work is navigating that natural tension. If it were easy, everyone would do it. But because it is not easy, is not a reason not to do it. But that is the value that we bring as legal professionals and regulatory professionals, is figuring out a way to arrive at a constructive solution, a way to resolve those two impulses that are necessarily in tension and both important.
Hey, SpaceWatchers, and welcome to our new episode of our Space Café Radio, the show about inspiring people in the industry. And today, I have the honor to have Nathan O'Connor, the General Counsel of the NEO Space Group, in our show. Thank you very much, Nathan, for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm great, and it's my great pleasure to be here with you today.
Cool. Let's kick that off talking about you. So what is your Space Connect and what brought you to Riyadh?
So like many people in the industry, I was fascinated by space technology and aviation from the time that I was a child. I always knew that I wanted to contribute in some way. My disposition and my circumstances led me into the humanities, and I became a lawyer, but I always had an interest in space. I started my career at a large international law firm in the London office, and I did my first space deal in 2009. It was a bond offering for Inmarsat. And I realized at that time, even though I was a capital markets lawyer by training at a huge international law firm, that there were people who had a similar professional background to my own, but who got to work on space matters all the time. About 18 months later, I was visiting California and had a chance just to visit Mojave. And this was 2010. And I was immediately struck by Mojave in those days was a real center for kind of what was called new space activity. I started knocking on doors, and many companies said, "You're a lawyer from New York City." My wife and I had relocated to New York from London. They said, "How did you get this address? Don't ever come here again," and slammed the door in my face. But there was a small startup, which is now called, or has been since acquired by Astrobotic, but in those days was called Maston Space Systems. And I joined as a single-digit employee in the early days of Maston and left New York, moved out to the desert. And in joining Maston, I got exposure to cross-training kind of across the entire upstream side of the business. I got cross-trained as a ground crew technician on the Maston reusable launch vehicles. I worked as a contractor on many NASA and DARPA programs and really got exposure to learning some of the technical aspects of the business, but also the sales and service delivery aspects of the business, as well as attending to legal matters. And that really helped me round out the professional training I had received both in school and at the firm on complex transactions, dispute resolution, all of those things, but really grounded in a way that could help address the needs of our internal customers. I spent a little while on the investment team at the economic development agency for Florida called Space Florida, recruiting companies to come to Florida, where I was exercising more of my investment and capital markets muscles, but also got a great look at emerging space companies around the world and around the United States. I ended up leaving Space Florida to join a small startup. It was called Made in Space, where I was the general counsel. We scaled that company to win a $74 million NASA contract and grow the company in a meaningful way, and then exited to a private equity firm. I stayed on as the general counsel of the platform, which we went on to do 9 acquisitions in about 3.5 years and list the company on the New York Stock Exchange. And that company became what is today Redwire. So I was the first general counsel of Redwire, and I served as the general counsel while it was listed as a public company. I was also the head of M&A during my time at Redwire. I learned about the opportunity to come to Saudi Arabia. Like many people, I had read about Vision 2030, and I really was curious. I'd never done any work in the Middle East. I'd done work throughout Europe, but the opportunity came up to join the NEO Space Group. And this was something where I found myself very curious about opportunities to contribute in a new market and also make sure we've got a robust, competitive ecosystem worldwide. And that's really how I found myself moving my family from the United States to Riyadh about 13 months ago. And I've been here ever since.
Oh, that sounds very interesting and an absolute stunning career. And there are so many touch points, and I have profound positive memories on Marston Space as well, because I'm ex-PT scientist. So we dreamed about the moon and worked very close together at one point in time. So it's a small industry, as we say.
before it was fashionable, we were both working on lunar technologies. And that's very true. I remember very fondly participating in the Catalyst program, which was the precursor to Eclipse. And I remember part-time scientists very fondly from those days.
Great. So we were supposed to meet at the Space Symposium in April, but our busy schedule were not friendly to both of us. Was this event significant in the current space industry landscape? So from your point of view, because you have been at the Space Symposium for a few times. So what was this year's edition made special?
I've been visiting and attending and speaking at Space Symposium for many years. And I always look forward to it as an incredible gathering and a place to take the pulse of different trends across the business ecosystem and the regulatory ecosystem for all space activities. When I attended the conference in April 2023, I had never in my career met a Saudi space professional. And many of my American and international colleagues had never had much opportunity to work with Saudi space professionals before. This year, we had a great contingent travel to Colorado to attend and participate at the symposium, including His Excellency Al-Tamimi, who is the CEO of the Saudi Space Agency. He's also our vice chairman here at the NEO Space Group. And we had a number of professionals from across the ecosystem here in the kingdom make the journey to Colorado. And for me, it was really powerful to have the opportunity to introduce my new Saudi friends and colleagues to space professionals I've known for many years at Space Symposium and see that connective tissue and that recognition of a shared sense of purpose, a shared sense of business values really start to click. And so for me, that was really a major highlight of the symposium this year. His Excellency Al-Tamimi also addressed with the leaders of the Canadian Space Agency and a few other distinguished guests on the main stage topics, and it was great to see his thought leadership in action. But so that, especially at a time where I think there's, and this is true in every year, that there's always a geopolitical narrative kind of as a background, but it was really powerful to be able to build new bridges at the symposium. It's an incredible venue for that.
Absolutely. And my observation was very clear that the international collaboration was this year on a new height, despite everything what we hear from the mainstream media. Let's focus on Saudi Arabia now. So what do you see is the most pressing legal challenge in the space industry today, especially for you in Saudi Arabia as an, I would say, fairly new player in the space industry? Arabsat is there for ages, but from the new space point of view.
I would say in my experience, and again, as a legal professional and as a space professional, there are challenges that are familiar to anyone who has, in my experience, have operated extensively in the United States and in Europe. There are familiar challenges, and some of those are a entire or a wide range of stakeholders whose interests are all important to economic activity and have to be taken into consideration in the United States. There's a familiar alphabet soup of regulatory interests, the FAA, NOAA, the FCC. Same thing in Europe, and here in the kingdom, there are regulatory agencies that have deep experience in many different areas of technology that kind of overlap on the business and interests of the NEO Space Group. And so making sure while we're undertaking our commercial activities that we're attending to the perspectives and the requirements of the different regulatory stakeholders across that familiar spectrum is one of the challenges that every company faces, but we face also here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I'd say another thing is, and again, this resembles what I've seen in the United States and what I've seen in Europe, but is a differentiator a little bit here in the kingdom, where I remember working the launch side in shortly after 2010, 2011, where the cadence of launches from the United States and the licensing regime and the possibility of commercial spaceflight participants were all very theoretical, and watching the regulatory authorities try and adopt a learning period. And we have the opportunity here in the kingdom of taking what is in business sometimes referred to as a second mover advantage. So being able to look at what other agencies have done to address problems that might be quite similar or to address emerging issues or opportunities and harvest the best of the solutions and reduce that to something might help bootstrap the industry here in the kingdom while also serving the important regulatory interests that each of those agencies are charged to protect.
Absolutely. So Now, focusing on Neo Space Group, so how does NSG navigate these challenges that you just spoke about, and what role does your legal team plays in shaping also strategies and ways around? Because you're contributing to the higher authorities, I assume, also with giving feedback to them.
Yep, that's a great question. So here at NSG, our activities fall within a few divisions, a few focus areas. So our first division is satellite-enabled communications. And our first activity in this division, since the company was announced a little over a year ago, is delivering in-flight connectivity. And so just to use this as one example, so when we think about international carriers who are flying here within the kingdom or flying abroad, there's a number of regulatory regimes that apply to delivering connectivity services over a non-terrestrial network. And so we work very closely with our colleagues here in the kingdom at both what's called the Communications and Space Technology Commission, the CST, as well as the King Abdullah Center for Science and Technology. TAXT is a key regulatory partner to make sure. GEOSA is another one that we interface with regularly to make sure that we're finding a way to make our service delivery efficient and compliant. And that efficiency is driven by proactive dialogue with the regulatory authorities and also with the center of government, with officials from the royal court to make sure we've got the opportunity to add our voice as an important commercial stakeholder as each of these matters is exercised for the first time here in the kingdom. So we've got satellite communications. Another division is our Earth observation and remote sensing line of business, where we announced last summer that we've been selected to receive a permit to offer or to operate and establish the first platform in the kingdom for Earth observation data, which we're working on and partnering very closely with our colleagues at CST. So that's another venue where we, in dialogue and aggregating commercial perspectives, both from prospective customers and prospective suppliers, to make sure if we think about Vision 2030 offering a path towards sustainable economic development, we're doing that with the concept of delivering value in exchange for money at the core of every legal solution or commercial solution or regulatory solution we're advocating for.
I'm very grateful that you gave us an insight into the regulatory framework, the regulatory environment. On one hand side, it sounds a very smooth sailing for you guys, what potentially is not the reality. So how do global regulations affect the NSG operations, and what changes are expected in the near future to make your life even more easy than it is?
Oh, no. And please let me clarify. I've been doing this for a long time. I authored responses to notices of proposed rulemaking published by the FAA for many years. I've been at this for a while, and experience matters. And so when I characterize the dialogue with the stakeholders, I want to be clear. It is absolutely, and the professionalism and the experience and the credentials of the regulatory professionals we interface with every day here in the kingdom is completely on par with the tremendous professionals I've worked with in the United States and Europe. But there's a natural tension between the commercial impulse and the regulatory impulse. And so part of our work is navigating that natural tension. If it were easy, everyone would do it. But because it is not easy is not a reason not to do it. But that is the value that we bring as legal professionals and regulatory professionals, is figuring out a way to arrive at a constructive solution, a way to resolve those two impulses that are necessarily in tension and both important. So I would say that to characterize my experience here has been consistent with my experience interfacing with regulators in many other markets, which is, again, reconciling those perspectives.
I think what you just reflected on, it's something that I experienced also in other Middle Eastern countries, in the UAE and Oman, in which 10, 15 years ago became new players in the space environment. And they started from scratch, literally from scratch, different than in Europe or the US, where you had a huge legal framework already in place that you navigated. Here, it was not a Wild Wild West, but it was a start. And so you could shape regulatory environments much more and more easily than we see it in Europe or in the US. And I think that we are both on the same side in this consideration, right?
Yeah, I think taking advantage of lessons learned. And so just to dig even a little bit deeper, in November of 2022, a draft Saudi space law was circulated for comment. And that's something that's still in the process of revision, and it hopefully will be issued in due course, but they're reflecting all relevant inputs as they finalize this. But some of those inputs, in fact, onboard lessons learned. And so when we think about that, there is an advantage to the effort to consolidate what have been disparate bodies of law or regulatory regime into kind of a clearinghouse, and to, again, harvest the best of what has worked well in other regimes. It is, I think, a second mover advantage, as I mentioned before.
Absolutely. I'm grateful that you just mentioned the Saudi space law, because it was on my hit list as well to ask you about the status, especially when we talk about the space activities like launches, satellite data protection, liabilities, and so on and so forth. These laws can be beasts in its own. And as we speak, we talk about a European or an EU Space Act here in Europe. We know where it's coming from. So can you give us a bit of an inside view where it all stands?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I will, of course, disclaim that we leave matters of state to the statesmen. We leave matters of regulation to the regulators. We're in a key voice and we bring our voice to the conversation, but we leave it to our friends and colleagues who are charged with issuing the law to do that in their own time. I will say, and I can speak from my experience on the commercial side, what has been encouraging reminds me of some of the most positive experiences I had working with regulators in the United States and in Europe, which echoes something that we repeat to ourselves in the M&A context. So when we go to acquire a business, a common refrain for the purchaser is first, do no harm. You don't want to make a change at the business you've acquired before you truly understand what you've acquired. And so I've seen in our dialogue the very pragmatic, realistic approach and recognition of the risk of regulating activities out of existence before they've even had a chance to gain commercial traction. And so when we think about the timing, we think about, again, another cliche is measure twice and cut once. So we see a degree of intentionality and thoughtfulness to make sure we're not going to end up with a regulatory environment that will have an unexpected consequence on inhibiting commercial activity, which is actually in the interest of the kingdom and in the shared interest of the people of the kingdom.
I see. Let's move back to an 10,000 feet view and let's talk about trends in space law and policy. And here I'm calling for your vast experience that you just mentioned. So how do changes in space law impact the growth of the commercial space industry? So at large and then obviously in the kingdom.
So I'll answer that by sharing a perspective I've shared addressing conferences in different forums over the years, which is my background is fundamentally the background of a transactional lawyer. And my specialty throughout my career, both at the law firm and certainly in-house, has been focused on transforming the business vision into executable reality. And that's a unique opportunity to contribute that we as transactional lawyers have of saying, oh, hey, we've got an agreement in principle with a supplier for whatever kind of unique arrangement our business people may have arrived at. And we could say, okay, great, let's take that. And this is how we could put it on paper. And then here's a mechanism to start delivering money in exchange for receiving value. So one of the potential impacts for emerging changes in policy and regulation are anything that introduces an element of uncertainty or destabilizes predictable outcomes can have a cascading effect on terms and conditions as we deal with counterparties. And so we see echoes of that they almost follow the headlines. And a great way to look at this in the United States is for public companies. You can go through the disclosed risk factors and you can actually get a really good sense of where business leaders are thinking of risk exposure. And as a general counsel, enterprise risk management is one of my responsibilities as well. So when I think about policy changes from a global perspective or regulatory or tax changes, I think about it both through the lens of how will our execution team, our transactional team, be able to account for changes in the law? How are we going to see T's and C's that need to reflect that, either to manage our own exposure, or if we're going to accept exposure, what are we going to get paid? What consideration will we receive for we're sharing that additional regulatory risk. And then that informs part of our calculus as well of assessing impact and probability of risk from regulatory or enforcement uncertainty, which informs our guidance to our business leaders and our board as part of our risk management practice. To just take a step even farther back, and I just mentioned I really, both in M&A and in our legal work, I love and have always been energized in my work in reducing what can be complex or theoretical matters to executable solutions. However, one of the elements of the forthcoming Saudi space law is language concerning dark and quiet skies. And so from my capital markets lawyer, in-house counsel, launch vehicle technician background, something as esoteric or theoretical as dark and quiet skies is something that I wouldn't ordinarily spend a great deal of time thinking about. But I will say, since coming to the kingdom, it's been an unexpected pleasure to camp out here in the countryside. So over the winter, my wife and children, we went camping a ton. And one of the things I experienced here that is harder and harder to experience in the big cities and in the United States and in Europe is wonder that dark and quiet skies can produce, both in adults and also in children. That's a precious thing to think about, and it's a valid thing to think about by our regulators. And so I've shared with you my split perspectives. On the one hand, I see the intrinsic value in these regulatory impulses, but I also see the other side of the coin, which is they can have unexpected consequences on commercial predictability and executability of commercial arrangements.
Absolutely. Let's talk about innovation and growth in the industry. And as we speak, there's an innovation initiative in the kingdom going on to select new companies or new space companies for accelerator programs. So I think you're doing very good on that. But is there any policy change needed to encourage more innovation and more growth, or is it good as it is at the moment? What is your view on that?
I would say 100% that it's a work in progress. And I would join you in praising the initiatives, and there's more than one. So in particular, NSG is partnering with CST on the Space Up initiative, which I encourage anybody who might be listening to check out. It's all over the CST website. It's on the NSG website, but it's really in the best tradition of different accelerator initiatives that have been successfully implemented all over the world, but really with a focus on the kingdom and focus on technology areas here in the kingdom. I would say in terms of encouraging the full spectrum at NSG, we're focused really on downstream applications, what is closest to the end user, rather than upstream applications, by which we mean satellite systems or launch hardware, things of that nature. And I think one of the things that the kingdom and all of the stakeholders that I've mentioned today are really thinking about is what tools from a regulatory standpoint can be offered to incentivize or in a way clear the decks to enable what sometimes starts as almost tinkering, but can grow into a full spectrum regime to ensure safety and protection of the common good, while at the same time enabling the development of technologies that by their nature sometimes involve very high energy applications or highly combustible propellants or anything of that nature. And I see here in the kingdom, and this is one of the things being here that has excited me a great deal, and I encourage anybody listening to come to any number of the events that are hosted by the Saudi Space Agency or CST, where they're actually gathering these entrepreneurs, hearing from them, what are the challenges, where do they see a blind spot or where do they see a hurdle? But it's encouraging to see them having that dialogue with potential entrants who are on different parts of the commercial spectrum than our portion of the value chain, which for the moment is focused downstream, having an active dialogue with regulators to encourage building a workforce that's experienced in these types of technology development activities and really capitalizing on the incredible output of the Saudi university system, and including international training, where so many folks have had both a combination of training here and then go abroad, or have a combination of work experience both here and abroad. It's really an incredible workforce.
I had the great honor to visit the garage last year during an event in Riyadh, and it was impressive to see the spirit, the mindset, and the speed of development with this young, sometimes not so young companies and entrepreneurs. And it was fantastic. And it gave me really a boost and a very positive insight into that. But Nathan, you struck one thought in my mind, and I would like to challenge you on that. And that was your previous discussion about the dark and quiet sky. Let's talk about space and ethics. So with this rapid growth of space exploration, satellite deployment, etc., what ethical considerations are at the forefront of NSG's legal efforts? Because that must be hard to bridge at the end.
Yeah, I think so very clearly, and this is something from my first days at the company, His Excellency Oswaha, who is our chairman, has expressed and reaffirmed a commitment to a culture of ethics and compliance. And that's important for my work as the general counsel because we attend to compliance matters, but having that tone at the top from His Excellency, the chairman, is really an important element of setting the culture for the entire organization, becomes part of the fabric of the way we think about our contribution to fulfilling Vision 2030. And so there, on the one hand, there's that kind of overarching drumbeat of a reaffirmation to a commitment of a culture of ethics and compliance. And then in practice, there's our mission of helping support Vision 2030, which itself as a pillar has sustainability and sustainable economic growth, sustainable utilization for future generations. And so that informs part of the calculus as we're evaluating strategic returns to think as we take guidance from our board, they're looking through those two lenses as well to make sure we're considering the spectrum of interests that serve first and foremost our shareholders' interests. But shareholder in this case is a public investment fund of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, who is also fully committed to the values of Vision 2030, which includes sustainability. And so that does, we talked before about the tension between the pure commercial impulse and the pure regulatory impulse, making sure we're giving credit to and accounting to things that can sometimes be less tangible than purely quantitative economic metrics is 100% of the investment analysis and the solution analysis that informs work that happens at NSG every single day.
I see. And you touched a few points that I want to reiterate here. So how is NSG addressing concerns about space debris and long-term sustainability of space activities, having the World Economics Forum Center established last year in Riyadh? That seems that all these things come together now like a jigsaw puzzle.
I think so. There's two ways. Number one is maintaining a voice and active listening in those conversations, including the forum that you mentioned a moment ago. The other is the more pragmatic capital markets lawyer in me, which says we follow in terms of our supply chain practices and our customer practices, rigorous KYC, know your client activities to make sure we know who we're dealing with and we make sure we're dealing with folks who are following along with applicable best practices throughout the industry on an entire spectrum of matters. And so that includes emerging matters like dark and quiet skies, where, as is even evidence in the draft Saudi space law, there's not a hard and fast black letter requirement that has decades of enforceable precedent, but making sure we're thinking about these things as we're making choices and trying to reconcile our commercial imperatives with our other ethical and vision-based imperatives in the course of doing our business.
As we are almost wrapping up, I would like to get your view on NSG's future vision. So what are the key strategic priorities for the next 3 to 5 years in the space sector, in the kingdom, in NSG from your point of view?
Yeah. So I've spoken a little bit about our satellite communications business with the IFC offering. I've also touched on our Earth observation and remote sensing activity, which in addition to the marketplace I mentioned, really has an incredible anchor in an acquisition from 2024 of a company formerly known as Tacnia ETS, which is now NSG Geospatial Services. And they provide digital map products, all kinds of insights that can be gathered from consolidating data from both satellite imagery to survey data to aerial survey, any number. And that has been really an incredible business. So continuing to see that grow, continuing to see that aggregate professionals is one of our core strategic priorities, is feeding those businesses that have already launched. In addition, we've got a part of our mandate is to move into the Internet of Things and the PNT domains. We have a few initiatives that we're working to lay the groundwork and launch commercial activities in that area. And then the fourth element, which really, as a person who comes from the upstream world, I'm very excited about, is our corporate venture capital activity, which we're still in the process of undertaking kind of foundational activities with our governance authorities and doing a lot of work with prospective stakeholders, doing market assessments. But really, that will be a tool in the NSG toolkit to identify areas for innovation that are adjacent to our core businesses and also fulfill the Saudi space strategy's priorities for space technology development, and really have a chance to participate with companies that are on the emerging end of the growth spectrum and really see those grow. As I've seen over my career, as I mentioned, I've been at a startup that had 8 people to I was the general counsel of a publicly traded company with international operations over the course of my career. And so being able to see opportunities to focus and grow on those emerging companies is something that's really exciting coming down the tracks here at NSG.
Nathan, thank you very much. It was a great roundup, but there's one point I can't you leave off the hook here, because you're a very passionate space lawyer working in a corporate environment and also not in academia, not in one of the UN organizations, really in the corporate environment. I have a question. So let's address the emerging legal professionals in the space sector. What advice would you give those looking to build a career in space law or legal aspects of the space industry?
That's a great question, and it is something that's very top of mind for me. And one of our mandates at NSG is also capability buildup. And as we've grown our legal team, we've had just incredible legal professionals join our team who are early career or mid-career, and they're grappling with some of the very same questions you just asked a moment ago. What I tell folks, I've said to folks over the course of my career, is one of the keys to being successful as a legal professional in the space industry is true whether you're in private practice or whether you work in-house like I have for most of my career. And that is being focused on finding a way to get to yes to meet the need of your internal client. So often we'll have, maybe I'll characterize it this way. I think there are many stereotypes about lawyers as the no police, or, oh, let's not take this to the legal team. They're just going to shut this down. In my teams and throughout our careers, we serve our clients, and we wouldn't work if we didn't have clients to serve. So when we get an issue, we try to think of if there's a regulatory or a legal reason for maybe not following a specific path to a solution. We want to make sure we're identifying the way that we think might be the way to get to yes. So there are many roads to victory. And so it starts really with a constructive mindset to say, how do we fulfill our obligation to protect our client, but also how do we enable our client to succeed? How do we get to yes? And so that mindset is really foundational for the teams I've worked with. The other things, it may sound like a cliche, but these are really fundamental. And that is even in law school, in the law review, in moot court, when you're doing any summer programs, when you're starting out at a firm or starting in-house, controlling everything you can possibly control. And that means, this is commonly expressed as attention to detail, but making sure you're bringing the rigor to the work product that you're bringing, whether it's to your supervisor, whether it's to an internal client, to say that you've given this all due thought and attention and you've attended to the details, will help establish a trust relationship with the client. And that is really goes hand in hand with another concept, which I talk about sometimes, which is the concept of completed staff work, which is the concept of before I make a recommendation to our CEO or to a member of our board or committee of our board, we challenge ourselves to make sure that our solution has turned over all of the rocks and has presented the decision maker with the option to either select a course of action or give us as little feedback as necessary. We don't want to find a problem and bring a problem without a solution. When problems are brought to us, or if we identify a problem, we're not just raising the flag. We're saying, hey, here's an exposure. Here's a challenge that we've identified. Here's 3 ways that we think we might consider resolving it. And here are the trade-offs. And our recommendation is option A. If you agree, let us know and we'll have the teams execute. If not, we're happy to pivot in a way that serves you. And that concept is, again, it sounds almost intuitive, but the legal professionals who I've been lucky enough to work with over my career who've been able to bring that into practice and do it consistently and form that as a foundational value have been able to succeed. And that's something that I see, again, the experience, the talent, and the energy. You mentioned this as well. All of the professionals that I have the chance to work with here are working hard in the belief that tomorrow can be better than today. And that's an energy that I find is really, really motivating. And it's something I'm proud to be a part of. And maintaining that attitude is another tip that may sound like obvious, but it really is a big differentiator. That's my 2 cents. But I'm always happy about if I hadn't had professionals at the beginning of my career who encouraged me to join the International Institute of Space Law or encouraged me to leave a major law firm to join a startup. These are the things that I think can have a cascading effect. And I'm happy to share.
Fantastic last words. Nathan O'Connick, thank you very much for your time and this fantastic interview, and good luck to you, to your team, and at NSG for a bright future. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And if you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Thorsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.